So our next speaker is Susan Schulten, and give me just a
Oh yeah, American 100 Maps. Yeah, that's
all right. So I am delighted to introduce Susan Schulten, someone whose books and talks I have greatly enjoyed. Susan is a consummate professional. She brings, I've just always felt each time I've heard her that she brings her subjects to life with her enthusiasm, thoroughness, and wonderful storytelling. I'm fairly certain I would have majored in history if I had been one of her students back when I was in college. Her book, America in 100 Maps, remains right next to me. Here, a dog-eared reference that I consult with regularly. She has a BA from Cal Berkeley and a PhD from UPenn. She is a prolific author and frequent speaker, and I am so grateful for her speaking to us today. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Tom. I am looking at your screen, but I assume I can also share my own if I'd like. Okay.
Yes, yes. Hold on just a second. Here you
That's
there
great.
you go.
Thank you so much. That's a lovely introduction. I'm a little bit embarrassed, but I appreciate it very much. I'm a bit of an evangelist for maps, so I feel like this morning I'm with my people. I've enjoyed both today and 2 weeks ago. I want to thank Tom Paper for all his hard work organizing and publicizing it. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten notices from the California Map Society, but other map societies about this conference. So that's pretty great. And along those lines, I'd also like to acknowledge all the work that John Doctor has done for so many years to get our work out to the public. It's astonishing to me how hard he works to keep things current and to share the news of our accomplishments, our upcoming talks, our ideas to a much wider audience. And then finally, I'd like to thank Ron Gibbs, who used to be my dear colleague here in the Map Society in Denver, and then moved on to greener pastures in San Francisco with Jane. But we continue to correspond, and I'm a great admirer of the way he's brought new people into the realm of medical mapping and the revolution and all that kind of thing. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into my talk here. I will move pretty swiftly because I think some of the things I'm going to show you, I don't have to actually evangelize too much, right? This is a group that is already converted. But let me tell you what I have in mind for today. All right. When I look at the folks on this call, I have some idea of the kind of things that brought you to maps. I know many of you are interested in a particular place through time. Some of you are interested in design. Some of you are collectors. Some of you have a very Catholic understanding of world history and use maps to reinforce or illuminate that. What I'd like to offer you today is what I try to convince other historians of who may not understand the riches that are locked up inside of maps and how maps can transform their practice of history. And that is, at the very bottom, maps offer something that I think no other material evidence in America does. Maps are these extraordinary portals onto the past, right? They give us a window on a specific moment in time and place in time. But what I'm going to also argue to you today is that there's a fascinating reciprocal relationship that continues to draw me back to maps after 25 years. And that is, maps are simultaneously records of that place and time, but they also in turn shape the future. And I'll show you the way that operates in different contexts across American history. If we think about how maps made America, how maps matter, why maps matter, you really can't do better than this one. Some of you were lucky enough to be part of the Rocky Mountain Map Society conference, lecture a month ago with Wes Brown, who focused on DeLisle and his master map of Louisiana in 1718. This map was made just about 3 centuries ago. DeLisle was the geographer to the French king, who had been asked by the king to make a map that would accomplish 2 fundamental objectives. One is the king wanted a master map, that is to say, a map that had the latest and best intelligence on the ground. And in that respect, you can see how DeLisle aggregated not just the information from La Salle and Champlain and other French traders and trappers and explorers, but also information from other maps, and including indigenous knowledge. But that's not the only thing the French king wanted. The French king wanted a map that would assert French supremacy in North America. And no other map in the 18th century does that better than this one. What you see here is de Lisle asserting a new understanding of sovereignty. The French, as many of you know, asserted that their power in North America derived from their exploration of the rivers, and thereby, as far as the rivers went, so too did their claims. That's a fundamentally different understanding of sovereignty than the British have along the coast, which is people on the ground, settlement, if you will, was the way in which they extended their claims. Those two claims are fundamentally at odds. They cannot be reconciled, and we'll talk about how they explode in the mid-18th century. But even earlier, you can see this map is the opening shot across the bow. Look at what de Lisle has done here, and we'll zoom in. Not only has he spread out La Louisiane in letters across the map, but you can see that he centered the entire map on the Mississippi, giving the continent a kind of symmetrical appearance that places the French at its center, territorially, but also politically. He's crowded the British colonies into the east, and he's marginalized, similarly, Spanish claims in the west. And the rest is for the French. Look at the way he's expanded the tributaries to the Mississippi. Look at how far the Ohio River goes. He has essentially flexed French power to its absolute territorial limit here, east and west, north and south. And of course, what the French had in mind was by virtue of exploring these river systems, they would create a vast north-south axis that will eventually give them claims not just to the interior, but moving east, as we'll talk about in a minute, and also west. There is no other geographical document in the 18th century that wields the power of de Lisle's map. And for that reason, it's been extensively covered, discussed, analyzed, not just by historians of cartography, but of course by historians proper. But for all the power of this map and all the riches that it unlocks, there are things that it fundamentally misses. And that's what I'd like to turn our attention to. You can see here, if you focus on the southeast, that de Lisle has very deliberately identified extensively native tribes, as well as Spanish and French routes of explorers. These were other ways to remind the British that others had been here first. Those are very strategic annotations on the map. And yet in 1718, there's something that de Lisle fundamentally misses. If I can draw your attention to Caroline, referring to the Carolinas in the southeast, I want to inform you about something that I didn't really know anything of, and you wouldn't know if you looked at this map. And that is, in 1718, a war was raging in the Carolinas between the British settlers and the tribes of the southeast. There is not a hint of that on this map. And to understand that, you need to pivot to a very, very different picture of that region. What I'm showing you here is a map that I know is familiar to some of you. It lies in the treasure trove of the British Archives. We don't know a lot about it. So much of what I'm going to tell you, I'm conveying to you from people who have expertise in Native American mapping, but a lot of it remains speculative. What you're looking at here is a map that was presented to Governor Nicholson, the newly appointed governor of South Carolina in 1718, who was trying to conclude the conflict with the Native American tribes and to forge relationships for several reasons, not least of which was to protect the South Carolina against being absolutely wiped out by that point in the Yamasee War. The war raged from 1717 to about 1720. And so what you're looking at here is a map that was given to Governor Nicholson after he called those tribes to Charleston for a conference. To his surprise, his own agenda was countered by this map. We believe that it was made by either a Cherokee or a Chickasaw tribal head. And you can see what we have here is that on the map, we have layers and layers of information. The most prominent are circles, the size of which correspond to the perceived power of that particular band within the larger Confederacy of the Southeast. We believe, like I said, that a leader of the Cherokee or the Chickasaw made this map as a way of proposing an arrangement, an exclusive trade arrangement with the new colony of South Carolina. And what was that proposal? If you see that there are lines connecting some of these tribes, the lines denote relationships. There are other tribes that bear no lines to others. That is to say, the relationship is non-existent. The Cherokee and the Chickasaw had recently broken their relationship with the colony of Virginia. And so therefore, the speculation is that this is a way to propose an exclusive deerskin trade arrangement with the newly found colony of South Carolina. What you see rendered in angled lines are the British settlements, as opposed to the rounded representations of the tribes themselves. To me, a map like this gives us not just one, but several portals onto that early 18th century moment. It's a moment in time when the French are actively moving east from the Mississippi. The British are quite aware of that. An alliance with several tribes between the French and the British would be most helpful. What I'm trying to convey here is that prior to the advent of British settlement and the removal, either through disease or through dispossession of native tribes, the tribes wielded tremendous power. And so what I love about this map is that it restores a level of contingency, which is, of course, the fundamental watchword for historians. That the way things are now is not necessarily the only outcome. This map reminds us of the terribly fluid dynamics of the early 18th century and how things might have moved in a different direction. I'll zoom in for you here because the map is so extraordinary for what it tells us. This is actually a copy of that original deerskin map that was sent back to the Crown. And so you can see the way in which they've inscribed this and explained how it came to them through the tribes. You see a representation here of the port of Charleston, the idea being that with that exclusive trade arrangement, the colony of South Carolina might rival the much more powerful colony to the north in Virginia. I show you this for all the reasons I've indicated, right? It reminds us of a particular place and time. It reminds us of fluid power dynamics. It shows us the imperial rivalries at work on the continent. And that's what I'd like to return to here, to go back to the Delisle map, because the conflict we usually hear about in the 18th century is the one between the French and the British, which of course is colossal. Those British claims, like I told you, continue throughout the 18th century as the British become more and more enmeshed in settlement, in an agricultural society, and especially enmeshed in the slave trade. By contrast, the French continue their explorations, particularly up the Ohio River. And you can see that that conflict is going to center right here on who has the power to the Trans-Appalachian West in the area that we now call the Ohio Valley. In the 1750s, this of course comes to a head. Both the British and the French see themselves as rightfully having control over the interior, even though ironically, neither actually has a fundamentally legitimate claim, given that there was an active native presence in that region. But the conflict, as you know, centers around sovereignty and separate claims to sovereignty. The French continue to encroach, particularly setting up forts along the southern bank of Lake Erie. And when that becomes known to the governor of Virginia, Governor Dinwiddie, in response, he sends a young 21-year-old man named George Washington over on a reconnaissance mission over the Appalachians to the headwaters of the Allegheny, to travel all the way to the shores of Lake Erie and to deliver a message that is fundamentally cease and desist to the French. And so the next map I'm going to show you gives you a moment in time. Some of you who are aficionados of George Washington, and I know that includes Ron Gibbs, are familiar with this map. The copy I'm showing you is from the British Library. We don't know if this is in Washington's own hand or copied from his. But the original map, of course, was drawn by him. He's sent by Dinwiddie to the shores of Lake Erie, and a lot happens to him on the way and on the way back. And that's what's really important, because when he gets to the shores of Lake Erie, which you can see right here to the French fort, he is very, very politely rebuffed and turned away. And he makes his way, you can see his little tracks, all the way back here. If you zoom in here on the important part, it's what happens to George Washington to and from the destination that really matters. In other words, by the time he gets back, he has more intelligence about this region than anyone in the French settlements or in the British settlements. He knows the lay of the land better than anyone else. He had spent the night in an Indian village of Venango, which is on the map, with some French soldiers who had a little too much to drink. And that loosened their tongues. And as he tells us, they told me it was their absolute design to take possession of the Ohio River, and by God, they would do it. So when he comes back down, he has an express message for Governor Dinwiddie. And that is this: the French are now coming down from their forts on and near the Lake Erie. And from thence they designed to the forks of the Monongahela and to the Logs Town, and so to continue down the river, building at the most convenient places in order to prevent our settlements. A little below Shanapinstown in the Forks is the place that we are going to immediately build a fort, as it commands both the Ohio and the Monongahela. So like I said, Washington knew more about this region than anyone in the colonies at that point. He knew how many French were in the region. He knew the terrain they were up against. And when he comes back and delivers this map to Dinwiddie, Dinwiddie immediately raises a militia and sends them out in order to forcefully stop the French. And so begins the 9 years war between the French and the British. Ultimately, and for our story, what's important is that the British prevail. The site becomes Fort Pitt and eventually Pittsburgh. And essential to this is the fact that the French are ejected from what will become eventually the United States of America. And so you can imagine the special savoring victory, or the satisfaction that the French must have took when about a dozen years later, they end up becoming the crucial injection of power that helps the rebels and the patriots defeat the British. All three of the maps that I've shown you here, the French, the Native, the British, are examples of kind of high politics, power diplomacy. It's very easy for us to point at these maps and to see why they matter in terms of turning points of American history. But that is just the tip of the iceberg, as many of you know. And I'm going to show you a few maps now that are much more diffuse, but equally powerful. Exactly a century after George Washington made his trip to the shores of Lake Erie, this map was made by and for German immigrants to the United States. As many of you know, from 1840 to about 1860, 4 million immigrants come to the United States. The vast majority of those are from Ireland, but a significant portion, about 1 million of them, come from Germany. Many of these are refugees from the failed revolutions of 1848. They are highly educated. They are people of means. And they have the discretion, unlike the Irish, who have very little choices in where they end up. They have the discretion to think about where they might want to move. And so while you don't have maps like this for Irish emigration in the 1840s with the potato famine, you do have many of them for the German immigrants. Like I said, they're educated, they have means, and they can think about where not just their families, but where their kin, where their villages might want to relocate. And so there's a lot of information on this map about distances from ports to interior. But what I'm going to do is to zoom in on the map of North America itself and to show you how many layers of information are on this and how much they can do for us. It might surprise you, but this is a map that's at the center of my course on the American Civil War. And if you begin to let your eye linger and see the layers, you can probably figure out why. The map identifies important places as of the date, 1853, that it's published. You can see red lines that denote trunk lines of the newly established railroads. Not all of them, but some of the most important. And in a little lighter blue color, you can see both natural but also artificial waterways, right? The canal season had peaked and now the railroads were overtaking the canals, but canals remained crucial in terms of bringing that far western territory of the Ohio Valley into the realm of the East Coast and most importantly, New York City. So let your eye, like I said, linger for just a minute on this map. And I regret that we can't have a back and forth because I'm keenly aware of the time. But here's where I let my students start to think and make connections for themselves. And here are some of the things they begin to notice. That the real connections on the map are between the Northeast and what we now call the Midwest. That there are very few connections, either by water or by rail, between the North and the South. Within the North, you find many, many more settlements and many, many more connections. And indeed, that's what I want to focus your attention on. This map was an advertisement for certain places, right? And as many of you know, a large proportion of those German immigrants come west to places like Illinois and most importantly, Wisconsin. This is the leading edge of that will really explode in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. But even beyond that, what you're seeing is a map that advertises certain places. And why would it advertise those northern places? Well, as my students sometimes take some time to figure out, what opportunity are there for free white men who own their own labor in an arena that is governed by slavery in the South? And indeed, there is no opportunity for immigrants in the South. The one exception, of course, is areas of St. Louis and areas of East Texas. But by and large, immigrants don't go to the South because the slave economy has no place for them. And instead, they're looking for places where they can replicate the styles and livelihoods that they remembered, and that is in the Midwest as farmers. Another thing the map shows you, that the connections show you the direction that the country is taking. In other words, what we're looking at here are states that are hurtling toward industrialization. While in the South, even though it's at the height of its economic power, remember that cotton is king in the 1850s, those profits are not being reinvested in the South. They're being reinvested specifically in slavery, but no infrastructure, no transportation, no diversification. And that too is crucial in explaining the trajectories that lead us to the American Civil War. There's much more about this map, and we can return to it in the Q&A if you're interested. But one product, of course, of the Civil War is the 13th Amendment, which forever destroys slavery in the United States. And if this is a map of massive demographic shifts and migration, so too is this. I'm showing you a map that's among one of my favorites. It's drawn in 1932 at the depth of the Great Depression by a young man named Elmer Sims Campbell, who was one of the first African Americans to graduate from the Chicago Art Institute with a degree in illustration. And Campbell's dream was to come to Manhattan and be a big deal, big city magazine illustrator. And he had the chops. He has a signature style that you'll recognize if you look at this and see his other examples. And his talent got him in the door over and over again. But of course, once editors saw him and saw that he was Black, that usually ended the interview process. And so at the depth of the Great Depression, Elmer Sims Campbell couldn't find work. But what he could find every night at the north end of Manhattan in Harlem was a great time. Elmer Sims Campbell loved the nightlife of Harlem. And every night with his best friend, Cad Calloway, they would enjoy everything that Harlem had to offer. I'm showing you this map for a couple of reasons. I certainly wouldn't argue that this is a consequential map in the sense that it transforms people's behavior. In fact, it's only published in a very rare run of Manhattan Magazine, which folds soon thereafter. But what I want to show you is the way in which this map, like the map of German immigration, has layers and layers of information. It shows you in a highly stylized way the height of the Jazz era, where Blacks, but also whites who were slumming from other areas, came up to enjoy a kind of illicit thrill. This is the tail end of the Prohibition era, so you can see all the activity that is being advertised is more or less illicit, but an open secret when the police are on the take. Campbell offers this nightclub map of Harlem to show us all the range of activity that is going on. And of course, you can use this map to show the tremendous demographic shifts. The end of slavery, of course, prompted massive migration eventually out of the South. And where did those African Americans go? They fled sharecropping and came north to places like St. Louis, Philadelphia, Chicago, New York. And so, in other words, a place like Harlem in the Jazz age is only possible because of the Great Migration. And so you can see this map as itself a product of several forces. The fact that the map advertises folks like Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway shows us something about technology. Those are only household names, of course, because of the recent advent of the radio. Some of the first radio broadcasts nationwide were live broadcasts from these clubs. The clubs themselves, if you zoom in, tell us a lot about what's going on at the time. You see the police up in the right corner, while there's mayhem outside, are very comfortable playing a game of cards. They're warm in the nice new police station. Small's Paradise was one of the first clubs owned and operated by African Americans and for African Americans. Other clubs, like the Savoy, were among the few that were integrated. And if you look closely here and there, you can see even pretty direct references to not just drug use and saying alcohol use as an understatement. This map is saturated in alcohol, but also open references to prostitution. The map gives you a taste of everything that was going on. And one thing I like to point out to students is that the people who actually lived in Harlem had very little say about the mayhem that descended on their neighborhood nightly. Now, Campbell gives you a kind of loving, energetic, pulsating send-up of this neighborhood that he admired so much. But you can also see, if you look between the lines, a kind of ambivalence, right? What we're talking about here is open corruption, crime, vice, violence, mayhem. And I want to gesture toward, finally, this is the last hurrah of prohibition. And what prohibition leaves us, of course, is a kind of state penal system that we continue to live with today. And so you can think about this map in terms of incarceration, in terms of corruption, in terms of who is and is not enforced when it comes to prohibition law. Now, finally, I want to show you a map by a guy who was also out of work during the Great Depression by way of wrapping up the talk. Elmer Sims Campbell couldn't find work in large part because of his race. Others couldn't find work, of course, because work was very, very hard to find in the Great Depression. One of the most talented men to come out of this era in terms of illustration was Richard Eads Harrison, who some of you know I have a long-standing interest in. Richard Eads Harrison is one of the men who is most responsible for reorienting American understandings of cartography and space in the 20th century. And to understand that, we have to, of course, remember that for most of the early 20th century, in classrooms, newspapers, textbooks, the map of the world that was most common was a Mercator projection map of the world. It is innovated in the 16th century as a sailing chart because direction is true, though distortion prevails. It is reintroduced in the early 20th century and quickly gains acceptability. And that's a longer story. But what I want to reinforce to you here is that by the late 1930s, when trouble is really breaking out across Europe, this was the most common way in which Americans encountered the world. And what I'll remind you of, something that's very powerful to me, is that there's a degree to which a map becomes so familiar that it becomes taken for the territory itself, as opposed to a representation of the territory. That is the level of currency and power that the Mercator projection wields by the late 1930s. And then all hell breaks loose in Europe. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. And by the end of the day, a map of Europe cannot be bought in the United States of America. Rand McNally sold more maps of Europe that month than in any other time since the armistice of 1918. More Americans came into contact with maps during World War II than any other time in the nation's history. I've talked to you about how this map became so powerful, so common, right? So accepted and ubiquitous. And that's why it was so maddening to someone like Richard Eads Harrison. It exaggerated the distance of the United States to Europe as well as Asia. It distorted massively the northern and southern latitudes, and it reinforced a sense of isolation that was not just inconvenient, but by 1939 was actually deadly. And so Harrison made it his mission to disrupt the Mercator projection. He wanted to, as he put it, shake Americans out of their cartographic coma and to force them to see themselves as utterly connected as opposed to separated from the world. What I'm showing you is one of his most famous and iconic visions. I'll hesitate in using the word map because I know that's controversial when you think about Harrison. But in September of 1940, Fortune magazine, which is where he finally landed after a long spell out of work in the early 30s, ran this map. September of 1940, think about that. That is when essentially the British are the last power facing off against Germany. And yet it is months away from the United States entering the war. This is the period in which someone like Charles Lindbergh is at the height of his power, arguing that the United States has no business entering the war in Europe and cannot defeat Nazi Germany. As he put it, it is not our problem. And so Harrison has a huge obstacle to overcome, and that is the entrenchment of isolationism that is reinforced by the Mercator projection. And in September of 1940, Franklin Roosevelt is desperately trying to convince Americans that this is their fight, that while he will not send Americans to fight any foreign wars, we must aid the British. And that's the seed, of course, of what becomes his destroyers for bases and later his Lend-Lease program. And in the midst of that campaign, Richard Eads Harrison issues this map along with several others to show Americans that they are not on the periphery, but rather at the center of this conflict. And so he shows Americans, rather than being apart, there are three ways in which they are already vulnerable in this war. And I'll zoom in on one. I quite like that in each of these three visions, Denver is identified, as is Chicago, reminding those bastions of isolationism that they too, even though they're in the center of the country, are not invulnerable, right? And can be reached, particularly by new powers of aviation. The most important technological innovation that disrupted the Mercator projection was the advent of flight. And this was a war that would be fought with aviation. Roosevelt understood that. He understood that in part because he had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I. He had a deep and abiding interest in world geography. And so when he sits down to give some of his fireside chats, he asks Americans to take out their map. And then he says, better yet, get back to your globe. Because the globe would remind Americans of the fundamental geographical relationships as opposed to the separation that they found once that globe was flattened onto a Mercator projection. What you're seeing here, I know that most of you already know this, but the Army Map Service creates a massive freestanding globe for Winston Churchill that you see on the right as a Christmas gift in 1942. Once FDR sees what the Army is capable of doing for Churchill, he says, I too would like one. And they create a replica for him that you can see just sits in the base. It is meant to freely rotate, not on an axis, but in other words, a way in which you can understand relationships from all angles. And so I see someone like Richard Eads Harrison as perfectly paired with someone with the sensibility of Roosevelt, who was desperately trying to remind Americans that the world is round and that they are approachable from all angles and that they must think of themselves as part of this war. I'm going to move forward quickly because I see the time and I want to leave room for questions. I've talked to you about the ways that the real interest for me in maps for history is the way that they operate reciprocally. That is to say, they capture a moment in time and they also influence that time. So here you can see Harrison making hundreds and hundreds of views like this, which are taken from an impossible angle, right? They are art. They are not really a map in a true sense of fidelity to longitude or latitude. They cannot be used for reference sake, but they are an argument. And Harrison is a powerful figure through which we can see cartographic ideas shifting. The cutting edge of this, of course, is where we sit now. And I know I'm speaking to a group of Californians, so you know what I'm going to tell you much better than I do. What you're looking at here is a rendering of what an autonomous vehicle sees, quote unquote, as it's moving through space. Autonomous vehicles are equipped with sensors and cameras that take in the world around them. They are that snapshot of the immediate environment. They are that reflection I talked about, capturing a moment in time. And then they send that information up, right, which in turn governs other vehicles and enables them to move through space. The rendering that you're seeing here was made by a company called Deep Map in Silicon Valley. And they created this so I could see what the car sees. The point being that this is, of course, a map. A car doesn't need a visual. The visual is made for the humans inside the car, as well as the engineers, to make sure that the car is on track, so to speak. In some ways, this is unlike any map in human history because it will never be static. It will never be rendered on paper because it is constantly shifting. It is, in other words, a database. It's in a cloud. It doesn't ever settle. And it will never be archived in the way that the maps that you and I love so much are archived. But there's a way in which it also reminds me of what draws us to maps across time and space. They are stories of movement, discovery, reconnaissance, and exploration. And in that sense, a map, if you will, like this, brings us back to the earliest maps before the discovery of America. Most of you know that you're looking at Henricus Martellis's map made on the eve of Columbus's voyage westward. The map, of course, is done before the discovery of a new hemisphere. There's a lot to say about this map, but in some ways what I want to highlight for you is the way in which the deep map of Silicon Valley is fundamentally like this one. It too is a snapshot of a moment that highlights reconnaissance, exploration, movement, and discovery. And the last thing I'll say is that the reason this map matters is because it's out of date. Most people in the world use maps because they are trying to get from one place to another or to analyze data. In other words, they are looking for maps that are on the vanguard and are current and accurate. But of course, what we love about maps is in part what makes them inaccurate. The moment at which they no longer represent space as we understand it is the moment at which they become invaluable windows for historians. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much.
I will stop sharing for you. There you go.
Wes, I have a comment for Susan, really not a question. It was just a wonderfully sweeping perspective and unifying across hundreds of years, the whole story of maps. So thank you for putting it together. I enjoyed that so much.
And why did you address it to Wes?
No, I'm sorry. I meant for Tom to address
Oh,
it.
I thought you thought I was Wes.
Thank you, Susan.
Well, I have a question, Susan. I love the whole Harrison and Mercator and Globe thing. What myopias, and I guess I'm describing Mercator as sort of, it was a myopia, or it was a way that people saw the world that then got shifted, right, through Harrison and through the globes. So what myopias do you think that we have today? You know, what are we seeing? How are we seeing the world today that may be changed, if you can predict, you know, of future explorations in the ways that maps show us the world today?
That's a tough one. I'm a historian, Tom, but I will say one thing, and I know this is kind of an old saw for those of us who are interested in maps. But the greatest handicap I see, and I have it in myself, is that with digital mapping, you are always at the center of the map. And I think there's some rather profound implications for that. There is no context, right, with digital maps, because they are serving you. And by virtue of serving you, right, what they get rid of is a fixed context around you. I suspect others on the call are better and more savvy about this than I am. I'm not a very up to the minute adopter of digital technology. And so I think there are others who have thought much more deeply about this than I have in terms of what myopias we have now. But I do see a kind of limitation in the way folks who never have been reared with static maps might have a harder time understanding them. But maybe that ship has sailed, so to speak.
You know, I very much enjoyed the presentation, and coming at it as a geographer and not a historian, I think you're especially to be commended in light of that question, in that I think some of the myopia is in that we're living in this map that's on our device and we're not seeing this sweeping view, which you did such a wonderful job of addressing at different scales and different cartographic styles and representations. And I found myself looking at Harrison's map thinking it looks like a precursor to Google Earth. And, and those perspectives really reframe our perspective on who we are and where we live. Even as a geographer, I'm not used to viewing it in that vantage point. And I guess my one question is, can we look forward to how maps made the American West as a upcoming presentation?
Well, that's a pretty, that's a nice one, because there's a brand new book actually that you might be interested in, Daniel, that I'm reviewing. It's by a dear valued colleague, Cameron Blevins, who came out of the Digital Scholarship Lab at Stanford. His new map is called Paper Trails, and it's about the way in which the Postal Service created what he calls a gossamer network. And you can Google that, because he has put up his data, and he'll show you the ephemeral but powerful nature of post offices across the 19th century and the way in which they extended power, particularly in terms of gathering reconnaissance information about the land and making those part of the high level maps that would be populating the late 19th century and the GLO and things like that. So that's one person that I think has really thought quite a bit about the meaning of mapping the American West by bringing in all of the federal government's bureaucracies, not just the ones we always hear about, like Wilkes and Fremont and Lewis and Clark.
Thank you very much. My name is Leonard Rothman, and I'd like to thank you for a wonderful lecture, as well as the other two lecturers. I do want to put in a plug for Mercator. He lived in the 16th century. He solved a big problem. The problem was that people on a sailboat were able to map a straight line to get to where they wanted to go. This was really important because they had not figured out yet how to find longitude, which was done later. So this is a significant advance, but we must not forget about history, because it really is important to see the progress that has been made, and you have elucidated it very well. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think what Harrison was astonished by, because he was a huge admirer of Mercator, he understood the revolution in the 16th century. What he didn't understand is how it took such a firm grip over the American imagination after 1900. That was a puzzle to him. And I think that's where the real interesting part is what was the power of the Mercator projection that gave it such truck and such influence after 1900. That's something that really occupied my attention in my first book, The Geographical Imagination, because that's a story in itself. It has to do with who was advancing ideas about the United States. Good, who worked for Rand McNally, and you guys all know the Good Homolocene projection, which is so important and accurate. That couldn't get play in the 1920s and 30s because it didn't look right, so to speak. And so there are good reasons for Mercator having the influence that it does in the 20th century.
I think maps are connected to cosmology. There are these frames, and of course some frames are more significant than others as American history played out. There's the frame of the Atlantic world. There are other frames, and you showed a couple, and I thought that was really interesting, like indigenous maps. They don't get much play, and we probably should pay more attention to that. In Berkeley, we have a map in our collection, which was a French map that was based on indigenous knowledge, and it was based on Huron views of the world. And it shows the Huron homeland, Southern Ontario, as an island. The Hurons conceptualized their homeland as the center of the universe, surrounded by these other people. And so the map reflects that. And so I think cosmology is very powerful. All your examples show that. When I saw the French map, I was thinking of the French Langlot survey, which privileges access to water.
That's
so
right.
We can see how worldviews are shaped, and maps reflect those worldviews, of course. They're powerful documents in that sense.
So we probably have time for another question. Do we have?
There are a few in the chat.
Go ahead, Emily. Do you want to highlight them, please?
Yeah, I'll share Patrick's question. He asked, I noticed you're quoting Richard Eads Harrison. Are there any good memoirs, bios, or other sources that you would recommend about him?
Well, I'm writing one. I'm working with the folks at Library of Congress. I'm dying for them to reopen because his papers are there. But Patrick, if you're interested, you can reach out to me. I've written an article about Harrison, and he's also a chapter in my first book, but I'd be happy to share the biographical information I have about him. I was one of the last people to interview him when I was a 20-something graduate student in Midtown Manhattan. That was a highlight of my graduate career. So stay tuned, but I am hoping to write a book with John Hessler on Harrison.
Susan, is a link to your article on your website, or is that available?
Yes, it was in Omagamundi. Should I put that in the chat? I know you're trying to wrap things up.
No, that's all right. We're okay. Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, sure. I don't know if you want to let people ask another question.
Yeah. Other questions?
There's another one in the chat from Edward. He asked, what was the fate of the globes?
That's it.
Those big ones?
Yeah.
Yes. I can't speak to the one in London. I don't think it's in the Churchill war rooms, but the one in the United States, there's a couple. The one that was Churchill's is now in the vault in the Library of Congress, and Ralph Ehrenberg will give you a wonderful tour. Ed Redmond used to do a similar kind of wonderful talk around, what do we call them? The massive globes. But yes, there's one in the Library of Congress. And I'm not going to be
2 points. I believe the original one that Roosevelt is shown looking at is now in Hyde Park. And what there is in the Library of Congress, I think, is a facsimile. There were about between 6 and 16 made.
Interesting. Emily, is there more?
From the chat, no more questions, just a lot of praise for your excellent conversation.
Well, what I'm going to put my email in the chat, because I'm not as savvy as some people about whipping out files and getting them. So please, if you'd like to learn more about Harrison, or the new book I'm writing about Emma Willard and information design, please just send me an email. I love trading notes with other folks. I love learning from other folks. Some of my mentors are here, Wes Brown, Judith Tyner, people who have really inspired me over the years. So let's keep it going. Thank you, Tom.
Susan, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And Jim and Courtney, thank you very much. Ron, any parting words?
Well, thanks to Tom and Mike and everyone who's organized today. 3 spectacular presentations, all very different, but wonderful. And to all of the members and guests for participating so actively. It's been a great meeting. Thanks to all.
Thank you, everyone. There is a talk that the New York Map Society has. If you haven't had enough and want to hear Chet Van Duzer talk, I put it into the chat. It's going on right now. But again, thank you, everyone. This has been terrific. I really appreciate everybody's participation.
All right.